I hope that you've having a great day and things are going well with you. So God bless you. I want to kind of go live here and talk a little bit about Tanwetamani right there. I want to talk about him. I want to talk about ancient Kush and talk about some things with respect to just the Kushite family and his famous dream Stela. There is a famous document, a historical document that was left behind by one of the famous kings, one of the kings of ancient Kush, who was a part of the quote unquote 25th dynasty, a part of the dynasty that took over Kemet and basically colonized and brought Kemet as a part of Kush. So he was a part of that. And he was the last person before he began to leave Kemet and go back to ancient Kush to continue to rule with respect to how the dynasty ended and how their time in ancient Kemet ended. He was the last ruler to do that, but he was a part of a dynasty that would go on for well over 1,000 years after he left Kemet and changed some things and the whole landscape will change. But I want to talk about him because I think it's important to talk about ancient Kemet and ancient Kush with respect to many of the things that they believe. Because as we talk about this document, we're going to go through this document on today, and we're going to talk about his dream state. We're going to talk about an artifact that was found in Napata in what is today the modern day Sudan. And it talked about his calling to become king. It talked about his calling to become ruler, how he became a ruler, how he became king, and what he did right after that. And what's significant about it, in my opinion, is the concept of their beliefs. We're not just going to talk about just what it said, but kind of dig into the meaning behind what was said. So we're going to dig into this as we talk about this. We're going to jump into the whole thing. And I want to thank you guys for joining me. I want to thank those who have subscribed and continue to subscribe to Black Education. I pray that you continue to do that. And for those who are members and are joining us from a membership standpoint, thank you so much. We have many courses and many books that we put out and that we show with respect to those who are actually paying members as a part of this whole group here in this channel right here. So I very much appreciate you doing that, and those who are members. So I want to thank you, and I want to kind of join and talk about this. So hope that you are doing well. And we're going to talk about Tanwetamani. We're talking about who was he, and what did this famous stone slab, if you will, that documented his time in Kemet and his call to be a ruler, what did it say, and how do we dig into it? And before we jump into that, it's a good idea to kind of put ourselves in some perspective here and kind of see who he was and where does he fall in this map, people. And I will be giving a copy of this to our members and putting on the membership tab very soon, a copy of this kind of timeline here. But if I kind of take myself away and give you some perspective, you'll see that on this timeline, you'll see several people who are part of the famous Napatan dynasty, the famous Kushite dynasty that rose again. So as you know, ancient Kush and that whole land that is modern day Sudan, especially in the northern part, that whole land period, it means it's been inhabited for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And if you go back 3,500 BC, you will find pre-Kerma and places around the whole area of Kerma, which is like right here. You can see right here in that where you say Kerma right there. That is an area that is historic. And just as things were developing in Kemet, they were developing in this whole Nile Valley. They've been developing for thousands of years, literally tens of thousands of years. So you can go back and see people here who the Kemetic people called either Yamites or, eventually we call them Kush, a number of things that they call them, a number of names, if you will, and various people that were around here, including Punt, if you go further down southeast. But what you find here is that there is a period of time where there's a surge. There is a period of time where there's trade and there's intercourse going on up and down the Nile Valley. And a period of time where the new kingdom comes in and begins to control this area of Kush, and then a period of time where Kush kind of resurges itself. So this is all happening, obviously, as kingdoms do. They rise and fall, they ebb and flow. But around 900 BC or thereabouts, you see a resurgence in Kush, and Kush, that resurgence is typically called the Napatan dynasty. And the reason why it's called the Napatan dynasty is it takes place right down here. If you can see that area, Napata, right there, it takes place where that's the center of the power structure, if you will. Earlier in around 3,500 BC, Kerma was the power structure. Around 900 BC, this whole area of Napata. And places like Jebel Barka, which is a holy mountain, which we'll talk about, there's a holy mountain there that's very significant to Amen and the people who were priests in ancient Kemet and all of Kemet as well as the famous burial ground and a famous historic burial ground, if you will, because if we take a look at this particular scene, this is from a burial ground of Tanwetamani. It's actually his tomb there. And so you have burial grounds in El Kuru, as well as Nuri, as well as Napata and Jebel Barka. They're all kind of gathered around Napata and becomes a central point, a central capital, if you will, for these kings. And some of these kings, as we kind of look at it, these are kings that people would later call the 25th dynasty, but That's not accurate really, because it's not really accurate because they were a dynasty of their own. They were ruling ancient Kush and resurging and bringing together the people in ancient Kush in 900 and 800 BC. They were already coalescing and they were their own dynasty. And this was a resurgence of people in this area controlling themselves, governing themselves, bringing together many different people of like minds, if you will, and kind of bringing different societies together under one coalition and under one king. And when they united under one king, that king was Alar, and it was maybe some people before him, but we called him Alar, and then it was Kashta, and then it was the famous Piankhy. And then you end up in Shabaka and Shabiktu, you have Taharka. So you have this whole list and line of kings. And it was under King Piankhy that they took over Kemet. Kush took over Kemet, and they were welcome. They were not necessarily invaders. They were people who were seen as practicing the ways of Amen, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And if you look at this, where does Tanwetamani fall into this? So as you can notice, you'll kind of see here, the famous Taharka kind of mentioned is the sixth ruler, if you will, in this line that begins with Alara. But you then see, Shabaka is before him, then you have Shabaka, and then you have Tanwetamani. So Tantwetamani actually becomes the ruler after the very famous Taharka. So Taharka, as you know, is the man who's mentioned in the Bible, is the Kushite king who's mentioned in the Bible. We've talked a lot about Taharka, and I'm going to be doing a course on him very soon for our members to talk more about him. He is the one who kind of, fought the Ausarian army several times. Sometimes he won, sometimes he lost. He lost on the last battle with that. But he is somebody who is a remarkable king who goes down in history as having done a lot. And at the end of Taharka's reign, when Taharka dies at around 664 BC, Tanwetamani takes over. And Tantwetamani becomes the king, and that whole, stepping into a role when the person who was there before you was a mighty person. The person did a lot of building, had a lot of accomplishments, was very, very, very well respected throughout ancient Kemet. Even when you go and you read some of the things with respect to the Bible or other things that are talked about with respect to him in historical documents, you will find that Taharka is mentioned quite a bit in Greek philosophy, in Greek documents, in the Bible, in Assyrian documents, obviously in Kemetic documents, in Kushite documents. Taharka stands out. I mean, you read some of the ancient Greeks who talk about famous kings in this whole area, they mentioned, out of all the kings they could mention, they mentioned Taharka. So he must have left a big impact and a deep impact on people. Well, as he died and he kind of moved on, if you will, you end up having this man here, Tanwetamani, take over. So Tanwetamani is coming into power and into rulership, almost kind of in a vacuum in the sense that, though things are kind of going to pot a little bit, the Ausarian army is kind of resurging, if you will. It's kind of taking over a lot of land and has already attacked Kemet several times. And Tanwetamani is stepping into this role as king. And how does he step into this role? How does he document? And we're going to look at this document and kind of share some things with respect to, because I think that it jumps out at us and jumps out at you in terms of, just the spirituality of it, the religiousness of it, the religiosity, if you will, as I like to say. It jumps out at you with respect to that. So we're going to go and just talk through this, because it becomes something that I think is significant and we can learn from. And I'm always fascinated to hear what people thought, what people believed, how they looked at themselves, how they looked at God. So as we talk about this Stela, this document that was found at Napata, at the pure mountain, the holy mountain that is there in Napata, and what it exactly said, it kind of starts off talking about Tanwetamani, and you begin to see Kushite beliefs. A lot of times people will begin to say that ancient Kemet and ancient Kush were separate in some way. You understand that the Kushite people and the people that we're talking about have very serious beliefs and very strongly held beliefs when it comes to their spirituality and their concept of God and what they looked at. So this very beginning talks about the good God on the day when he was born. Atum is he for the people, Lord of the two horns, ruler of the living, prince seizing every land, victorious in might on the day of battle, facing the front on the day of conflict, Lord of valor like Montu, great in strength like a fierce-eyed lion. And it talks about him being wise like Tahuti and crossing the sea in pursuit of his enemies. So you begin to see right there, here's this Kushite king who is talking about things with respect to how this was found in the whole great holy mountain that is there in Napata in today's days, northern Sudan, talking about, being like a tomb. And a tomb, as you know, is that concept of God from a Kemetic standpoint, who is the self-generator, that who brings about itself, that who brings about life from itself, not begotten by anybody, but brings life from him. And so he's comparing himself like a tomb, and that he is helping the people breathe and helping the people leave and to live, if you will. And so you here have this Cushite king that's talking about Kemetic deities, a tomb, and talking about Montu. And you would know Montu if you remember Mentuhotep II and Mentuhotep I and various people like that. He's talking about Montu. So all in this very first opening part here, he's talking about Montu, which is a strong deity of strength that was a part of Upper Kemet, as well as talking about a tomb and likening himself to that and being a part of that. And then he talks about, even moving further, kind of, as you know, Kemetic kings and Cushite kings had several names. And he talks about himself that, he's fighting and none is standing before him. And that even he's the king of Upper and Lower Kemet, and that he's the son of Ra. And we're talking about Tanwetamani. He's the son of Ra. So here in this very opening stanza, if you will, we're talking about a tomb. We're talking about Ra, Montu. And it says that he is the beloved of Amen of Napata. And when we talk about Amen of Napata, it's very interesting to me because as I read this, we know that Kemetic people and Cushite kings saw themselves as manifestations of the divine. But what's interesting about the Kemetic way and the Cushite way of doing it, in particular in this Stela, he talks a lot about Amen. You hear Amen a lot, like you would hear Amenhotep and Amenhotep III and things like that. And a lot about it talked in Karnak and Thebes and Auset, but they talk about Amen as Amen of Napata. They talk about Amen as associated with Napata from a Cushite perspective. And even in some Kemetic documents, they talk about Amen of Napata as if Amen had the ability to reside not just in Karnak and Thebes and Auset, but resided in Auset as well as resided in the mountain, in believing that Amen inhabited this mountain, which kind of looks like a Uraeus. Part of it looks like a little bit of Uraeus there, but that Amen was in this mountain. And it wasn't just him saying it. This was something that the people in Auset at the great temple of Karnak that's dedicated to Amen also said. There's actually some people who talk about, I may read this with you and share this with you later on. There's a gentleman by the name of Timothy Kendall and another gentleman who wrote a whole kind of expose around the Pure Mountain and around Napata, talking about maybe even some of the ceremonies and some of the buildings at the temple complex that was in Auset was maybe built to kind of be more kind of like almost like a pilgrimage, almost like a mimicking of what was considered to be the home of Amen in the Pure Mountain, what was considered to be the place where Amen resided. So when they talk about this whole Stela, they mention Punt, they mention things of this, but they mention Amen as if Amen has just as much right to live and to reside in Napata at the Holy Mountain as he did in Karnak. Iperisut. And that's an amazing thing. So when you start to look at this religious philosophy of ancient Kemetic and ancient Cushite people, they're one and the same. They're meshing, and so whether or not we try to get into, debates about who believed what first, we obviously know that there was a meshing of this culture. And we see this is very important for us to start to understand what were they talking about? How did they believe this? And how can we use this today and have to think about it? So he mentions him being beloved of Amen of Napata. And as we kind of jump into that, God bless you. Hope you're doing well. Anytime. God bless you. When you forgot, hope that you're doing well. Taharka. Okay. Piankhy. Okay. I love you. They didn't exist. We know that they're there. Taharka and Piankhy. God bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your comment. So his dream. So Tanwetamani is there, and he is talking about as we mentioned. This is him right here. He is talking about his dream. So after he mentions him being beloved of Amen of Napata, it talks about his dream, and it says in his first year of his coronation that His Majesty saw a dream at night, and that there were two serpents. And you know that there were two serpents that were kind of representing the northern part of Kemet and the southern part of Kemet. And he said in his dream, he saw two serpents, one upon his right hand and one upon his left, if you will. Then His Majesty awoke, and he found himself, and the serpents and the snakes were not there. And he said, where did this dream come from? What happened? And what's going on? And his scribes basically answered him and said, basically, you own the Southland. Thine is the Southland. Take for yourself the North as well. They're saying to him, you have the South already. And keep in mind, he had the South, including Upper Kemet. So a lot of times you must understand that when we talk about the Cushite people who were ruling ancient Kemet, they were not seen, especially by the people in Upper Kemet, Edipet Sut. There you see the whole area where there is a Valley of the Kings and there's a Valley of the Queens. There's Hatshepsut's famous temple. Those people there did not see the Cushite people as foreign. And when they talk to them, they're talking, you are the king of this land. They're not just saying you're the king of the Sudan or the king of Nubia, if you will. They're saying you're the king of Upper Kemet. You're the king of the Southland. And from a Cushite standpoint, this was all South. They were really the kings of the two lands, if you will, if you include Cush in that. And so they're saying to him in his dream, his response, his quarters and people who were around him, that you are the king of the South. Take the North also. The two goddesses, they shine upon your brow, just like the Uraeus as you see. And you will see that Cushite kings, when you see a Cushite king, you typically see the brow of them. You typically see them with two Uraeus. You don't just see them with one. You typically see them with two kind of sticking out. Here, it's kind of hard to see right here a little bit. I have to show you in another one. You see them with two Uraeus sticking out, really saying that they are, manifesting that rulership of the two lands. And so they're saying to him, you are king of it all. Don't just take the South. And you have already Upper Kemet, go take the North again, take that as well. And so he goes, and after he's basically kind of assumes his kingship, if you will, he goes to Napata. And think about this. Now, this is a king who is king of Ptahhotep. People never talk about the Cushite people being welcomed and ruling Kemet. I mean, they just kind of just brush this over because we don't want to think about this place being a land where all these different people lived and contributed, right? Throughout time, not just in this period. You had multicultural, different, diverse things happening, and people just not talking about it. People not talking about the contributions of all the people were there, and all the black people were there. So as we think about this, he goes back to Napata. And there in Napata, he is crowned king again on the throne of a in his first year. And he's talked about, that he's there and there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of people for him. So this is interesting. He's not being just crowned king in Upper Kemet. He goes to Napata. The Cushite kings respect the area. They're not the kind of people who have to stay in Upper Kemet or stay in Lower Kemet in the very northern part to make themselves feel good or to have the opulence. It is apparent that they know that their society is strong. It is apparent that they know that they are ruling from their center of society. The king, the capital, if you will, of this whole area, Cush and Kemet, would have been Napata. If the king is ruling out of Napata, the capital would have been there. They would have had power centers, obviously, but this is where the king goes to have his home base. And the Cushite kings are not, disrespecting their homeland. They are respecting their power that they have in Cush. And so he goes back to Napata, which is in the modern day Sudan. And he talks about, being there and accepting the dream that God has for him. He says, in this Stela, the dream that God gave me is true. It is profitable for a man if he sets God's dream in his heart, and it's evil for them who do not understand it. So think about that. The whole idea that if you get a dream from God, if God gives you a vision, it is profitable for you. It's best for you to have that dream in your heart. Set it in your heart and don't forget it. And for the person who does not understand the dream that God gives them or doesn't allow it to sit in their heart, that person, that's evil for them. It's going to be a bad day, if you will. This is Cushite wisdom. This is Kemetic Cushite wisdom being talked about in his Stela. And so he went to Napata, as I said, while none stood before him. So he was basically having no opposition to his rulership, if you will. Now, this is at a time when the Ausarian people, as I mentioned, had come and they had taken over part of Kemet. They had several battles of back and forth with a lot of people in the whole area, but also with Taharqa. And this is the time that Taharqa has died. And the Assyrians had come back into Kemet after fighting Taharqa once. Came back into Kemet and fought him again and basically took over part of the north. And so Tanwetamani has decisions to make, right? He is seeing God give him the glory and give him the ability to unite the two ends. Again, what do you do when you're in that situation? So he's there, and it talks about him that he goes to the temple of Amen. Once again, when they talk about Amen, they're talking about Amen of Napata, and that he's residing in the pure mountain. So as you stop and look back, we're talking about this holy mountain that kind of looks like a Uraeus as part of his cliff kind of sticking out of the mountain, kind of detached from the mountain there. He's talking about going to the holy mountain and that Amen lives in this holy mountain. They are saying it, and it's repeated over and over again in a lot of Kemetic theology and Cushite theology, that Amen, the Amen that the whole 18th dynasty is talking about, the Amen that the new kingdom is talking about, Tuk Ankh Amen, Amen of Ptahhotep is residing in this mountain that is the pure mountain in Napata, in what is today the Sudan. And that was something that was commonly referred to in religious circles, especially during this time. And he talks about going to the mountain, the pure mountain of Amen. And that, that Amen is the Lord of Auset, if you will, and that he's residing in that mountain, and that he's bringing a ceremony. He's bringing gifts to God. He's bringing gifts to God in the mountain. And he is basically celebrating his coronation And that in order for him to celebrate his coronation, it wasn't enough. He couldn't be crowned king, if you will, just in Kemet and be looked at king. He had to go back to Napata, to the pure mountain, to perform the ceremony in order to receive this kingship. And it tells you how important the Kushite people looked at their own land and their own city and area of Napata. And so he talks about him doing that and how he performed offerings. He gives oxen and jars of beer and various things to men in Napata at this pure and holy mountain that's there in modern day Sudan. So that's what he's doing there. And then he decides to go north. And so he decides, okay, now it's interesting because apparently he was already north, maybe in Auset, comes south and gets coronated at the pure mountain, takes on the role of kingship, and then he decides to go back north. And he's saying, that they talk a lot about Amen, as you know, as being the hidden one, whose name is hidden from the gods, that Amen's name is hidden from the gods. This concept that things are inside of you, that there are things that you have to kind of get to know for yourself from an internal perspective, are things that were touched on a lot in Kemetic and Kushite theology. And from a Kushite perspective, this is what they believe. This is something they were firmly believe. They were not, disrespecting this or somehow not connected to it. This was a significant part of the belief that would persist for well over 1,000 years after Tanwetamani, dies. They're still practicing this whole belief and still committed to Amen and this whole idea of it. And so he talks about going at not just to parts of Upper Kemet and Napata. He starts to go to Elephantine. I want to kind of give you an idea where Yebu. If you look at right where the first cataract is, right where the word says Upper Kemet, and you look on the right hand side of the screen, you see the first cataract. Just above there is Yebu. And people call it today Elephantine. They call it Elephantine because of the trade. Really, think about it. It was a lot of ivory and a lot of ivory tusks that were being traded up and down this whole corridor, this whole highway, if you will, that was the Nile Valley, up and down the Nile, coming from Central Africa. So that one of the furthest southernmost towns of what was the traditional boundary of Kemet was Yebu, or they call it Elephantine. And so at this point in time, the Kushite people owned all of this. They took all of this, Lower Nubia, Upper Nubia, all the way down from the 5th and 6th cataract, all the way going up. But he's talking about here going into one of the towns, Elephantine, which was an historic town, and that he went there and he arrived at the temple, and the temple of Khnum Ra, who was considered to be the Lord of the cataracts. The idea that the source of the Nile and that the cataracts were a significant part of what gave life, and a significant part of what was part of happy, a significant part of what would bring life and prosperity to all of Kemet and all the Nile Valley. So he goes there and he is performing ceremonies to Khnum Ra. So you see that the ceremonies that he's performing ceremonies of that of a king. So when you look at ancient Kemet and you look at Auset, you look at the Kushite people, these kings are performing ceremonies that kings perform. They're not performing ceremonies in any type of, fancy, unfit way. They're performing ceremonies in front of the priest, in front of the most famous temple. One of the most famous historical temples, period, is Temple of Karnak, Ipet-Isut. And at a period of time, it was the largest temple in the entire world. And here you have Kushite kings, there performing ceremonies and basically running it, being over it, being in charge of it. And the king is in charge of the country. And so as he's going, he goes up to Auset, to the city of Amen, and he goes there and he sails to the frontier and he enters the temple of Amen-Ra, and he goes there and he performs all types of ceremonies, and the priests themselves come before him and they honor him as the king and as the ruler of their land. So he's no longer in the Sudan anymore. He's in Kemet. He's in what is today modern day Egypt. He's there in Auset in what is today Thebes. He's at the temple of Karnak, Ipet-Isut, and he is performing rituals that the priests are coming to him, recognizing him as king. And so I think that's very significant as we look at that. And so you find that there is more of a cultural commonality here. You find there's more of a cultural significance than what people like to talk about. I like to talk about what we share in common, the things we have together. And a lot of times people just skip over these parts, even though we know it happened, even though it's well documented, how they worked together, how they were connected with one another, and how the people in Kemet looked at this Kushite king as being king, as being rulers, and how they interacted with each other. So as he moves forward, he's kind of making his way north. As he makes his way north, he's praying to Amen-Ra, he's performing ceremonies at Ipet-Isut, and he's doing there in Auset, and then he starts to go to the delta. And, he goes to the Delta and to the Northland, and people begin to say, they begin to be happy to see him. And they basically say, welcome to you. We want to welcome your soul, your very Ka, the very spirit of you. We welcome Tanwetamani. We want you to sustain the two lands. And you have to remember, this is in the wake of the Ausarian army. This is in the wake of the Ausarian army coming in and at some point in time setting in their own rulers. The Ausarian army had come in, and this is why they were fighting some back and forth with Taharqa. They were coming in trying to take over the northern part of Kemet, and they were setting up their own rulers. And the Ausarian army was brutal. I mean, we've talked about that. You probably know that the Ausarian army, when they came into places like Kemet and other places in that whole area, what is the Israel, Syria, places like that. When they fought you, they killed you. They took people's bodies and put them on poles. They skinned people alive, apparently, and put their bodies and some of their skins on the outside of the walls of the cities that fought against them. I mean, they did some horrible things. The Ausarian people, that's what they did. They were a war machine, and they were coming in to take over Kemet. And so Tanwetamani is right in the heart of that, right at the heart of their height, right at the heart of their brutality, and they had already come into Kemet back and forth with Taharqa before Taharqa died, and he won. He fought him off, and then they beat him. And so he's coming. Tanwetamani is coming in the face of one of the most powerful armies that the world had ever known at this point. And so he comes into the north, and the people know the Kushite people. A lot of the people there do not necessarily want to be under the Assyrian rule. It was a brutal rule. And some of the people come and they say, welcome you. We welcome your spirit. We think you're going to sustain alive the two lands. You are the keeper of the two lands. You're the ones who are going to erect our temples. You're going to fix up those things that are in ruin. We have like a foreign power over this. You're going to help make things right again and take us back to the way things used to be. You're going to help sustain our statues and make sure the shrines are where they need to be, and that the gods are being worshipped, that God is being worshipped in the way it should be in our area. And not only gods and goddesses, but also the glorified dead, those people who are being remembered through offerings. The whole idea of ancestorship in ancient Kush and ancient Kemet just cannot begin. That's an African thing. That goes a lot of places. A lot of people are very important, very significantly connected to their ancestors. You can go in the Far East, in Japan, all kinds of places. But it's particularly important. It's significant in Africa. It's significant in ancient Kush. The idea that you remember your ancestors, that you connect with them, that you are a part of them, that you connect with them. So they're talking about not only is he going to make sure that the offerings are given to gods and goddesses, but they're also the people who are our ancestors, who are respected, are going to continue to get their due. They're going to continue to get their respect and the offerings that we give to them and the ways in which we remember them. So that becomes a significant part of what they do. And so he comes, and it's time to fight. It's time to fight now, because although he was welcomed by some people, not everybody's welcoming. He goes up because, remember, this is the Assyrian army has set in people, and this is around 664 or so BC, or thereabouts, 660 BC. The Assyrian army has 664 BC. The Assyrian army has set up their vassals, their puppet governments. And so people are not, they're not afraid to fight against Tanwetamani, because they have the Assyrian army that's going to kill them if they don't. And there are other people who are paying tribute to the Assyrian army. So Tanwetamani is walking right into that. He's kind of walking right into that whole idea and that whole thing. So he goes right into Memphis, and the people who were the children that came forth for rebellion, it said that they came to fight with him. So he's fighting with the people who are the sympathizers and are on the side of the Assyrian army. He's basically facing the Assyrian army, right? He's fighting people who are on the side of the Assyrian army. And he said he made a great slaughter of them. Their number were being unknown. His Majesty took Memphis, or Ptah, and he entered into the temple of Ptah, south of the wall, and he made a great festival and oblation to Ptah, and he appeased Sekhmet, who is important, the great who loves him. So he goes and he fights the very, very important city of Memphis, where there are supporters and people who are on the Assyrian side. So he's basically fighting Assyrian forces there in Kemet, and he's taking them over. And so a lot of people talk about what happens after this, the next battle, which is a significant battle, but they rarely talk about this, which we know. So he's being a brave man. He's going into a city in an area where he knows the Assyrian army is going to come get him, and he knows the Assyrian army has its people and its soldiers there, and he's fighting them, and he's taking it over. He's fighting them, and he's taking it over, as I mentioned. And so he begins to not only do that, he begins to also go back and talk about his father Amen, and to build things in Napata and into Nubia, and that the whole idea of continuing to worship God and to worship Amen in Nubia, Amen of Nubia, Amen of Napata, becomes a significant central point of this. Nobody is talking about, war for war's sake, or not talking about God in the context of war. You will see sometimes people in some of the ancient things you might read in historical documents talk about war just for the sake of war. Many of the Kushite people, in particular Kushite, like King Piankhy, Tantamani, you will see them talk a lot about their religious belief. A lot of other people do it too, but you will see a significant way that it's talked about from a Kushite perspective. So he begins to talk about, again, what he's doing with our men, and this whole idea of building things and building something special. And he builds a special hall. And I want to kind of show you this, because he builds a special hall in this mountain, in the holy mountain of God. And as he builds this thing, he talks about this mountain, and he mounts things with gold, and that the panel was of cedar, and that it was censed with myrrh of punt. He talks about, even in Kushite, the Kushite people are referring to punt in a holy way, the same manner in which Sahure in the 5th dynasty, or Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty, wanted to bring myrrh from Punt to bring back and to have God's land, if you will, in Kemet. These people in Sudan, in what is modern day Sudan, in Kush, are talking about right here around Napata, around the 4th cataract, talking about having myrrh from Punt, being a part of their temple of Amen that they're building at the Holy Mountain. I think that's remarkable. I think it's clear that when you start to look at these things and read it, you find there are all kinds of people up and down here, and a lot of people respected Punt. A lot of people looked at Punt as being God's land, and it wasn't just one person, one kind of African person in this whole area. We like to just lump everybody into groups. There were people who had distinct societies, their own nations, their own kingdoms, their own setup, all up and down this area. It wasn't just Kush and Kemet. I like them, right? But it wasn't just Kemet and Kush. There were other people up and down there, and who were also respected. And Punt is one of them. So it's amazing that they talk about Punt in the Stela that's at the Napatan temple, if you will, that they talk about Punt there, and they talk about having things from Punt. And so he talks about more how he's going through, and how he's delivering tens of thousands. And it's interesting to me as I look at the numbers here, but they talk about delivering things to our men, that they delivered tens of thousands, and then they went down by a factor of 10, if you will, then thousands and hundreds and tens. It's just interesting to me. You can clearly see tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, that, there was a use of mathematics. A lot of people will, say things about Kemetic mathematics, and, they did this or they didn't do that. It's clear that the Kushite people and the Kemetic people at this time, and even before this time, are using mathematics in different ways. So I just found it interesting that they went up, they kind of went up by a factor of 10 as they went up by 10 to hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. I thought that was very kind of interesting. So they're kind of measuring the amount of calves that they're giving to our men. And then the Stela goes on to talk about the campaign in the Delta, and that he went to the places in the Delta, because you got to think about it. When you went to the upper part of ancient Kemet, it wasn't just Memphis. I mean, the Delta is kind of a vast area, especially if you have to cover this on foot. I mean, it's not like you have to cover this on foot and with animals, right? So this is a vast area. And the Ausarian people were all through this area. They had their vassals, and they had their servants, if you will, and their puppet governments all in this whole area. So it wasn't just enough to take Memphis. He had to go face them too. So he went to them. It's kind of funny. He talks about them. He went to go fight with the great ones, and that they went into their strongholds as beasts crawl into their holes. And that His Majesty spent many days there. But, as he went there, none of the people there came out to fight him. That is, as he went there to basically siege them and to face them on. The people who were in the Delta, the rulers, many of them who had been set up by the Ausarian army, went into their cities. They kind of barricaded themselves, and they wouldn't come out to fight him. See, there was a lot of fighting going on, especially in the north, because they're right there in that crossway as Ausarian was trying to come in, and Tarhaka was fighting, and now Tanwetamani is coming to fight. A lot of people, they just didn't want it. And so you find what happens is that as he starts to kind of leave them after he spent so many days and nobody dared to fight him, he goes back, and then it begins to say, the people start to come, and they start to come to him. And Tantwetamani asks, as his supporters come around him and say, those people who are in the Delta, those kings and rulers in the Delta, they're now coming to you. And Tantwetamani says, what do they come for? Do they come to fight? If they come to submit, then they should live from this hour. From this very hour, they will live. But if they come to fight, they're going to die. And they basically say, no, it was kind of hard talk there, kind of tough talk. He says, they said, no, they come to submit. And so you finally have the people who are in the middle part of this Delta, in this area in northern Kemet, coming to Tantamani, and they're giving up. They're saying, you are our Lord. We are submitting to you. Kind of, we'd rather have you control us, because the Ausarians really don't want to control us. They submit to him, and they say, come to us, and they submit to your king. You are our Lord. And he begins to say, you know what? as I started to think about this, he started to say, as for my Lord, this is this God, this Amen Ra, who's residing in the pure mountain, the great next God, whose name is known and vigilant. He is beloved and giving valor to him who serves him. That God gives valor and bravery to him who serves him. He who possesses God's plans does not go astray. The person who possesses God's plans does not go astray. Here's Tantamani. This is all coming from the dream that he said he had in his heart. He's saying that God told him to take over the two lands, that he was going to go and be successful, and that when you possess God's land and God's plan in your heart, you do not go astray, nor you err it, right? You don't make mistakes, if you will. And so he says, he told it to me by night. He told it to me the night, and behold, I'm seeing it in the day. God gave me my vision at night, and now I'm seeing it in the day. And so he begins to kind of have that possession, to put that possession in his heart. And that becomes interesting to me because this man is speaking spiritually. This is all stemming from this dream that he had and speaking to us in the idea that when you have something that you can do, even if people around you don't know it, it's important to have that connection with God. And God will give it to you at night and you'll be able to see it in the day. So he begins to continue to talk. And the people begin to pull themselves and to prostrate themselves before them. And then he talks about, they say, whatever you do, whatever God has, you know what will happen when you're looking with God and you're working with God, that you just know the word of design is with God, that God knows what will happen, and this decrees of God, and whatever God decrees will come to pass. You have a connection with God. If you believe what God decrees in your life will come to pass. And so he's talking about faith here. When we think about a lot of things from a religious standpoint, this is a document of faith. This is the document talking about going and following your heart. This is a document, no matter what happens to you, because some people will say the end of the story, the end of his life is not so glorious. People may say that, but they're kind of maybe missing the point, because this man is making a statement that's being read thousands of years after he died, that may still be read 10,000 years after it may be kept 10,000 years. He's still making a statement to posterity and to the future that we're reading about and we're talking about today, which I think is amazing. Never stop and think, because sometimes the message that God has for you may not be the message that other people think. It may not be the thing that other people think. And when you think about it, it's very interesting, because a lot of people talk about what happens when his tomb, as we take a look at his tomb and some of the things that were around his tomb and some of the things that have survived around his tomb, many things in the whole area of ancient Kush and that part of Napata, a lot of things over the past 1,000, 2,000 years have been destroyed. A lot of it, like a lot of this whole area, has been robbed and vandalized. And one of the very few tombs that are still intact is Tanwetamani's. He said something. One of the very few, there are a lot of things that were destroyed and we wish we could find more. There's still stuff there to be found. But when you go back and you look at a lot of these things, there are too many things that were destroyed. But his tomb, which you're taking a look at right here, was remarkably preserved. When you see what God has put in for you, the dream that God puts in your heart, somebody might think it means one thing, that it leads to one thing, and God may see that it leads to another. It may be that this man needed to speak to us thousands of years into the future, maybe tens of thousands, maybe 10,000 years from now, we'll still know his name and know his story. Maybe he needed to speak 10,000 years into the future to be able to speak hope into you and I. So as we start to look at it, he's talking about, what God plans makes sense, and the things that God has, will move forward, and that, God is revealed to you. And it says, the people are talking to him. They're having a conversation with him, and they're saying, God has revealed to you the beginning, and he has completed for you the end in prosperity. God has revealed to you the beginning and has completed for you the end. And so you think about that, it's poetic, and you start to say that's the manifestation. That's kind of what he's saying in his life. That's what he's saying about what he did. God revealed to you what would happen in the beginning and completed it for you in the end. And so you start to see, something that speaks to us today, that can speak to you today as you start to have challenges or look for things in your life as you're working with it. So he says, so he moves forth, and the people begin to continue to come up to him and to continue to make things with respect to him and to continue to kind of submit to him, if you will. And he becomes somebody who eventually, has the people who are working with him and the people who are serving him really look up to him and to see him as a leader. And at a point in time when the Kemetic people were under the hoofs, if you will, and the thumb of the Ausarian army, like under their control, quite literally under their control, And so he begins to kind of have a respect in his life, and a time where he leads the people back together again, and he's able to take over that whole area of the northern part of Kemet. He's able to reunite the two lands. He's able to take the people who were fighting for the Assyrian army and probably presumably members of the Assyrian army itself, and to defeat them, and he unites the land again. Now of course after this happens, the Assyrians come back, which is why we know of them in life, right? They come back and they end up tearing through this area. They end up tearing through the northern part of Kemet, and they end up tearing through the southern part of Kemet. And Tanwetamani ends up having to leave the area and to go back to Napata sometime after this whole Stela, sometime after the events of the Stela happens. He ends up going back to Napata and never giving up his beliefs, never giving up any of that. And it's interesting because when you read some of the annals of the Assyrian army and the annals of Paul and those sort of things, you begin to see that very shortly after this, not long after this time where they had this fight with Tanwetamani, as well as other things are going on for the Assyrian army, Assyria, it kind of collapses. It's still in the 7th century BC where you see them begin to have a downfall. Some of it is infighting. You see the rise of other people coming up fighting for their territory in what is today modern day Iraq and that whole area. But it's not long after their stand in Kemet that they don't exist anymore. They don't exist as the powerhouse, the Assyrian army. You end up finding the 26th dynasty in ancient Kemet takes over parts of Kemet, and the people in Kush go on for another 1,000 years. They go on for 1,000 more years, and there, and Tanwetamani's family and Tanwetamani's and the whole, if you will, the whole part of the area that is kind of like that kind of moves forward. Taharka's line begins to move forward. And you see Atlanursa and Espelta and people of that nature. They begin to go on for another 1,000 years. And Tanwetamani helps to further that on. His life and what he did with his life helped to push that on and to push the Kushite people forward. So I just wanted to share about it. I wanted to talk about him a little bit. I wanted to give you his name, Tanwetamani. Remember this man, remember him in history, and please share this with somebody and tell them about it. Talk to you soon.